The first thing I noticed, waking up dead, was that my ribs didn't hurt anymore. The second thing I noticed was that I was lying in a bathtub full of lukewarm water, fully dressed in a tuxedo, and someone was pounding on the bathroom door yelling my name like the building was on fire. "Caleb! Caleb Whitman, if you fell asleep in there to get out of giving a toast, I will drag you out by your ankles and make you give it soaking wet." That was my cousin Ronnie. I knew that voice. I knew this bathroom, the ugly gold swan faucets, the smell of my mother's white tea candles. I knew, with the sudden lurching certainty of a man who has just watched his own funeral rewind, exactly what night this was. The Whitman Foundation Gala. The night my parents stood on a stage in front of 400 of Boston's finest people and announced, with tears of genuine joy in their eyes, that they were formally adopting Nathaniel Cole as their son and heir, while I stood 2 feet away in a tuxedo I'd paid for myself, smiling so hard my face cracked, because that was the night I found out where I actually ranked in my own family. I sat up in the bathtub. Water sloshed over the side and soaked the bath mat, which, in fairness, was also going to get ruined in about 40 minutes when my father would have asked me to step back a little in the family photos, so Nathaniel could stand in the middle. "Caleb, I'm alive," I called out, in the flat voice of a man reconsidering that statement. "Unfortunately. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I did not come back from the dead with a burning desire for revenge. I didn't clench a fist and swear vengeance on the ceiling. What I felt, staring at my own dripping reflection in my mother's antique mirror, wet tuxedo and all, was something closer to the specific exhaustion of a man being handed the exact same pop quiz he already failed once. And, if I'm honest, the immediate, overwhelming urge to go back to sleep instead of dealing with any of it. Being reborn is exhausting. Nobody warns you. Quick aside, before we go any further, if reborn chaos, petulant rich people, and a CEO who apparently flirts exclusively in real estate metaphors sound like your kind of morning, stick around. Follow the channel for the rest of Caleb's very messy, very buttery second chance at everything. Okay, back to the bathtub, 24 years old, a pastry career I hadn't started yet. A family who loved me right up until they found something shinier. A man, well, we'll get to the man. I had exactly one thought, clear as a bell. I am not doing this again, not the fighting. Not the years of trying to earn my way back into a spot that was never really mine to lose, because it turns out you can't lose a chair nobody actually saved for you. In my first life, I fought for that chair for 3 more years after this exact night, smiling through slights, taking meetings nobody wanted me in, calling it effort instead of what it actually was, which was begging with better posture. It ended with a heart that had simply run out of places to put things, at 27, alone in an apartment my parents had never once visited. Not doing that again either, obviously. This time, I decided, standing in a bathtub in a ruined tuxedo at 24 years old, with a second chance nobody had asked me if I wanted, I was going to let them have it. All of it. The chair, the company, the golden replacement son with his good table manners and his uncanny ability to remember which fork was for salad. I was going to let my family choose Nathaniel, and then I was going to go make croissants somewhere they'd never think to look for me, and possibly take a nap first, because rebirth is, again, exhausting, and nobody was paying me overtime for it. Ronnie was still knocking. I opened the door, and she took one look at me, soaked, hair dripping, tuxedo bow tie gone crooked, expression suspiciously calm for a man who'd apparently been face down in a bathtub, and her mascara-heavy eyes went wide. "Okay, what happened? Did Aunt Margaret say something? Did you fall in? Are you having a breakdown? Blink twice if you're having a breakdown." "I'm having a breakthrough," I said. "There's a difference." It just looks the same from the outside, mostly because I refuse to explain it while dripping on antique tile. You look like a drowned Ken doll. Thank you, Ronnie, always so supportive. Here's a fact about Ronnie you should know. In my first life, she was the only person in that entire family who never once looked at Nathaniel like he'd hung the moon. She just thought he had punchable teeth and an unnerving ability to remember everyone's birthday. Ronnie was 26, worked in non-profit fundraising, and had never met a family scandal she didn't want front row seats to. I decided right there, damp and freshly reborn, that I would keep her. Everyone else in that ballroom downstairs was, as of tonight, entirely optional. She grabbed my sleeve. "You cannot go down there dripping like a mop. They're about to do the toast. Your dad's already looking for you." Let him look, I said, and something about my own voice surprised me, steady, almost amused, none of the old flinch in it. Actually, you know what, give me 10 minutes. I want to make an entrance, or possibly an exit. I haven't decided yet, and frankly I'm too tired to commit to a bit this early in the evening. Ronnie's mouth curled slowly into the exact grin she used to get right before we'd sneak into the kitchen at family parties and steal an entire tray of my mother's caterer's stuffed mushrooms. "Oh," she said. "Oh, I don't know what's gotten into you, but I like it. Here is the thing about my family, laid out plainly, the way I never managed to say it out loud the first time around, because saying it out loud felt like admitting I'd lost. My father, Robert Whitman, ran Whitman and Holt, an auction house that had been selling other people's inherited furniture to other people's inherited money since 1911. My mother, Margaret, ran the Whitman Foundation, the charitable arm that let rich Bostonians feel good about themselves twice a year over past hors d'oeuvres. I was their only biological son. I was also, by their quiet but consistent estimation, a disappointment, because instead of going to business school like a reasonable heir, I'd gone to culinary school, and instead of climbing the ladder at the auction house, I worked the pastry line at a hotel kitchen downtown, coming home smelling like burnt sugar and flour instead of boardrooms, and, if we're being honest, taking every single one of my allotted breaks. Because unlike my father, I have never once believed that skipping lunch builds character. Then, 4 years before that gala, my father's cousin's son, Nathaniel Cole, 22, orphaned, Ivy League, unfairly symmetrical face, came to live with us for a semester while he sorted out his life. The semester never ended. Nathaniel was charming in the specific load-bearing way that made adults relax around him, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. He asked my father thoughtful questions about acquisitions. He learned my mother's tea order. He called them Uncle Robert and Aunt Margaret right up until the night they decided uncle and aunt weren't quite the right words anymore. I didn't hate him, actually. That was the humiliating part both times. Nathaniel had never once been cruel to me. He didn't need to be. He just had to exist, competently, in the exact shape of the son my parents had apparently been quietly hoping for the whole time they had me. It's a strange thing, being quietly replaced by someone perfectly nice. If Nathaniel had been cruel, or scheming, or even just mildly insufferable, I could have built a tidy little resentment around him and called it justice. Instead, he was just a genuinely good-natured guy who happened to be everything my parents had apparently been waiting for, and I spent the better part of my first life unable to decide whether that made the whole situation better or infinitely worse. In this life, standing dripping in a bathtub with the benefit of hindsight, I'd landed firmly on worse. But at least this time around, I wasn't going to spend 3 more years pretending otherwise for the sake of looking gracious at dinner parties. So, the gala, the toast. My father's hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, my mother dabbing her eyes, 400 guests applauding, while I stood at the edge of the stage smiling so wide it hurt, because someone had to keep smiling, and it clearly wasn't going to be anyone who actually meant it. That was life 1. Life 2, I decided in the bathtub, was going to go differently, not because I was going to fight for the stage, because I wasn't going to stand on it at all. I came downstairs in a dry suit, my backup tux, the navy one I actually liked, the one my mother had once called too casual for the Whitman name, which frankly was the exact review I wanted from her, and walked straight past the sound stage where my father was tapping the microphone, past the ice sculpture of the Whitman and Holt logo slowly weeping onto a silver tray, and out onto the terrace, where the January air hit my damp hair like a slap and felt, honestly, incredible. That's where I first saw him again. For the first time, if that makes sense, which it didn't, even to me. James Sinclair was leaning against the stone balustrade with a glass of something amber he wasn't drinking, watching the party through the French doors like a man auditing a museum exhibit he found mildly overrated. 31 years old, CEO of Sinclair Ventures, a real estate and hospitality empire that owned, among other things, half the waterfront properties my father's auction house had spent a decade unsuccessfully trying to acquire. The two families had been circling each other at every gala in Boston for years, technically allies, actually rivals, the way old money always is. Alpha, unmistakably. You could feel it from 10 feet away, that particular gravity some alphas have, where the air around them seems to organize itself into straighter lines. Dark hair, the kind of jaw that looked engineered in a lab for magazine covers, and an expression of such profound, elegant boredom that I'd once, life one, humiliating, buried memory, spent an entire party's worth of nerve trying to make him laugh and failed completely. In Life One, James Sinclair was the man I loved quietly and uselessly for 6 years, from a safe, sensible distance, while he treated me with the same mild, distant courtesy he apparently treated everyone, pleasant, correct, and utterly unreachable. He came to 2 of my birthdays because our family's businesses overlapped. He sent a card when I moved out after the adoption fallout. He never once, not once, gave any indication that he'd noticed I existed as anything other than Robert Whitman's other son, the one who made pastries instead of profit. I'd died still a little bit in love with a man who probably couldn't have picked my voice out of a lineup, so you'll forgive me if, seeing him again on that terrace, my very first reborn instinct was not romantic. It was petty. "You're not drinking that," I said, walking up beside him and nodding at his glass. He looked at me, actually looked, dark eyes doing a slow, unhurried once-over that had absolutely nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that I was standing outside in January with wet hair like an idiot, and said, in a voice like a door easing shut, "Observant. It's a party trick. I also know you hate the shrimp puffs, and you're only out here because your father called an hour ago about the seaport deal and you needed air." Something flickered behind his eyes, the first genuine crack of surprise I had ever, in either lifetime, gotten out of James Sinclair. "How would you know that?" "Because I spent 6 years memorizing you like a language nobody was ever going to let me speak," I did not say. "Lucky guess," I said instead, and smiled. Not the wide, hollow, performing for the room smile I'd worn inside for an hour, but something smaller and more real, because standing outside in the cold with nothing to prove to anybody for the first time in either of my lives felt, unexpectedly, like relief. "Enjoy your fake drink, Mr. Sinclair. I have a toast to miss." I turned to go. His hand, not grabbing, just resting, warm even through my jacket sleeve, landed on my arm. "Whitman," he said. "You're not going in for the toast?" "No," I said, and meant it with my whole chest for the first time in either version of my life. "I'm really not. Here's where I tell you about the emotional payoff, because it happened faster than I expected, and I'm still not entirely sure it was my idea. I didn't go back inside. I went to get my coat. James Sinclair, for reasons I would spend the next several months pretending not to think about, followed me. "You're actually leaving your own family's gala," he said, not quite a question, standing in the coat-check hallway with his hands in his pockets, like a man who had nowhere better to be, which, given that he ran a company worth more than several small countries, was objectively untrue. "They're not toasting me," I said, handing my ticket to the attendant. "There's no reason for me to stand there and clap along. Your father's toasting his new heir." "My father's toasting the son he actually wanted," I said, and it came out lighter than I meant it to, almost cheerful, which seemed to unsettle James more than if I'd cried. "It's fine. I make better croissants than boardroom decisions anyway. Everybody wins." "That's not." He stopped, recalibrated. I watched him do it, watched this man who ran negotiations for a living visibly search for the correct move and come up empty, and found, embarrassingly, that I liked him more for not having one ready. "That's a strange way to talk about your own family disowning you. They're not disowning me. They're just finally being honest about who they wanted the whole time." I shrugged into my coat. "I'd rather know now than find out in 20 years. "I'd rather know now than find out in a will," is what I actually meant, and what I actually already knew, from a version of this story where I found out at my father's funeral that the house had gone to Nathaniel, and the auction house had gone to Nathaniel, and I had gotten, as a footnote, my mother's old recipe box and a note that said you always did love to cook. Inside, applause rose through the walls, my father's voice, muffled, saying something that got another wave of clapping. I didn't flinch. That surprised me more than it should have. James was watching me with an expression I couldn't place yet. I'd get better at reading it, later, much later, but that night it was just a low, careful attention, the kind you'd give something valuable you weren't sure how to hold. "Where will you go? Does it matter?" "It might," he said, to me, and then looked immediately, genuinely startled that he'd said it out loud, like the sentence had escaped custody before he could stop it. I laughed, actually laughed, surprised out of me, the first real laugh I think had in either lifetime around this specific terrifyingly composed man. "Careful, Mr. Sinclair. Somebody might think you care. God forbid, he said dryly, but he didn't take it back. That was the moment. Small, cold, smelling like coat check cedar and somebody's expensive perfume, that I decided this life was going to be different in more ways than one. Not because he swept me into his arms under a chandelier, nothing so dramatic. Just a man in a hallway, quietly refusing to let me leave without knowing where I was going, when nobody else at that party had thought to ask. It occurred to me, standing there dripping cold air onto my mother's imported runner rug, that in my entire first life, not one person from that ballroom had ever asked me that question, "Where will you go?" because nobody had ever imagined I'd need to go anywhere at all. I was supposed to stay quietly, indefinitely, adjacent to whatever the family actually wanted, waiting my turn at a table that had already been fully set without me. James Sinclair, a man I had exactly one prior conversation with in this entire lifetime, had managed to ask the one question that actually mattered in under 2 minutes, standing in a coat-check hallway that smelled like mothballs and old money. I decided right then that I liked him considerably more than was strategically advisable. "There's a bakery on Newbury Street," I told him. "Failing, badly, because the current owner doesn't know a laminated dough from a phone book. I've had my eye on it for a year. I hadn't, not in this life. I was inventing the plan in real time, the way you invent a raft while already in the water. But the moment I said it out loud, it felt less like a lie and more like the truest thing I'd said all night. I'm going to go buy it, and then I'm going to make the best croissant in Boston out of pure spite." James Sinclair looked at me for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that I wouldn't understand for months, and said, "I'll hold you to that. Is that a threat?" "It's a reservation," he said, and for one unguarded second the corner of his mouth actually moved. Not quite a smile, the rumor of one. "For the best croissant in Boston. I expect a table." I walked out into the cold that night lighter than I had felt in either life, and it took me embarrassingly long to admit the reason wasn't just the family I'd finally stopped fighting for. The bakery was real, as it turned out. Beacon Rolls, a sad little storefront on a side street off Newbury with a leaking espresso machine and a landlord who wanted out. I bought it with 3 years of hotel kitchen savings, and a loan I probably shouldn't have qualified for, and I spent the next 10 weeks up to my elbows in flour, learning the particular, unglamorous joy of building something nobody had handed me, and also learning, more slowly, that I could delegate almost anything I found tedious to a very capable 17-year-old, which felt less like laziness and more like sound business strategy, a distinction I maintained with a completely straight face. My mother suggested more than once that I rename the place Whitman's to reclaim the family name for something respectable. I declined loudly in front of a Boston Globe reporter covering small business openings, which was possibly not my most diplomatic moment, but was extremely satisfying. The renovation itself was, in a word, humbling. The previous owner had apparently believed that laminated dough was a countertop finish, and the oven, a genuinely ancient deck oven with a temperament I came to respect the way you respect a large, unpredictable dog, took 2 full weeks of coaxing before it agreed to hold a consistent temperature. I slept on a cot in the back office for the first 10 days, surviving on the exact 3 items I could make with the one working burner, and told myself, repeatedly, that this counted as character building rather than a symptom of extremely poor planning. Ronnie showed up on day 4 with a folding chair, a 6-pack, and absolutely no offer to help with anything physical, and declared herself emotional support and quality control, a job she took extremely seriously, mostly by eating everything I made and rating it out loud. The first regulars trickled in before I'd even finished painting. A retired schoolteacher who came every morning for black coffee and a slice of whatever I'd overbaked the day before, a pair of art students from the design school down the block who started referring to my scones, unprompted, as an experience, and an elderly man named Mr. Osi, who informed me on day 1 that my croissants were adequate, and then proceeded to return every single morning for the next year, which I eventually understood to be the highest compliment he was capable of giving. My parents called, at first. My mother left messages about family obligations and how it would look. My father sent one stiff, formal email about reconsidering rash decisions that I read once, laughed at, and did not answer, because answering felt like effort I had specifically retired from. Nathaniel, to his credit, texted me exactly once, I never wanted it to be like this. I believed him, mostly, and told him so, and then muted the group chat, because muting things had quietly become my new favorite hobby. James Sinclair showed up on opening day. I want to be very clear that I did not expect this. A man who ran a billion-dollar company did not generally personally attend the grand reopening of a 200-square-foot bakery run by his family's oldest rival's estranged son. And yet there he was, at 9 in the morning, in a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, standing in line behind a group of NYU students like a very tall, very confused heron. "You came," I said, when he finally reached the counter, because I genuinely didn't know what else to say to the sight of him folded slightly to fit through my too short door frame. "You promised me a table," he said, "and a croissant." "I don't have tables. I have 2 stools and a windowsill." "Then I'll take the windowsill." He looked briefly, almost nervous, in a way that did not fit his face at all, like watching a mountain consider small talk. "Do I need a reservation for that?" "For you," I said, sliding a croissant across the counter. "Still warm. I'll make an exception. Don't get used to it. The exception, not the croissant. I'll happily overcharge you for the croissant on principle." He took a bite standing at my counter in his $3,000 suit, and something in his expression genuinely, unguardedly shifted. Not performance, not the careful diplomatic pleasantness he wore in every photo I'd ever seen of him. Actual, unrehearsed surprise. He looked down at the pastry like it had said something rude to him. "This is genuinely the best croissant I have ever had. I told you," I said, absurdly, embarrassingly pleased. Spite is a very effective leavening agent. Also butter. Mostly butter if I'm honest, but the spite helps with the crumb structure. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Within a month, the windowsill had, unofficially, become his. My part-time counter help, Priya, a sharp-tongued 19-year-old art student who worked mornings before her classes, started calling it the CEO's perch, and charging him full price out of pure principle, which he paid without complaint, tipping enough each time to cover what I strongly suspected was most of her rent, out of some instinct toward generosity he clearly didn't know what to do with in smaller doses. We fell into something that didn't have a name yet. He'd come in before his first meeting, order the same croissant, and stay exactly 11 minutes. I know, because I started timing it, mortifyingly, the way you time something you're afraid to call what it actually is. We'd talk. About nothing, mostly. His terrible relationship with his own father, who ran Sinclair Ventures before him and still hadn't fully let go of the wheel. My complicated non-relationship with mine. The specific tragedy of Boston traffic. Whether pineapple belonged on anything, ever, which he defended with a level of seriousness that made me laugh so hard I burned an entire tray of scones and had to start over, muttering the whole time that this was, technically, his fault, and he should feel bad about it, which he did not. "You're doing it again," he said, one late April morning, watching me pipe ganache with more focus than the task strictly required. "Doing what?" Avoiding looking at me, I very deliberately did not look at him. "I'm working." "You're hiding," he said, not unkindly, and reached over the counter, a liberty he had never taken before, to gently brush a streak of flour off my jaw with his thumb. His hand was warm. My whole face went hot in a way that had nothing to do with the oven. "Caleb." It was the first time he'd used my first name. It landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there. "James," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. He didn't say anything else that morning. He just looked at me, really looked, the way he'd looked at me on that terrace, except now there was nothing careful about it at all, and then, very deliberately, kissed the flour-dusted corner of my mouth before he left, so light and so brief I almost thought I'd imagined it. Except my heart was still slamming against our rib later when Priya asked why I was smiling at the oven like it had proposed to me. "Shut up," I told her, still smiling. "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking it." "I'm thinking a lot of things," Priya said, wiping down the counter with the air of a woman who had just won an office betting pool she'd started herself. "And most of them are finally." It took him 3 more weeks after the flour on my jaw morning to actually ask me somewhere that wasn't a windowsill, and when he finally did, he managed to make it sound like a hostile acquisition. "I've secured a table," he announced, striding into the bakery at close, still in his suit, tie loosened in the specific way that meant he'd come straight from a board meeting instead of going home first. "Saturday, 8 o'clock. You're not working." "I own the bakery, James. I decide when I'm not working." I've already spoken to Priya. You spoke to my employee about my schedule? She agreed readily, he said, entirely unrepentant. She called it long overdue and asked if she could have Saturday off too, in solidarity, which I found unrelated but agreed to regardless. I stared at him, at this ridiculous, magnificently overqualified man standing in my flour-dusted little shop at 8 p.m., visibly nervous underneath all that boardroom polish, tie crooked, hands shoved in his pockets like he didn't trust them not to reach for me without permission, and felt something in my chest go soft and warm and a little bit terrified. "Are you asking me on a date, Mr. Sinclair?" I said. "Or are you hostile takeovering me on a date? Would it help my case if I said both?" "It would help your case," I said, wiping flour off my hands and stepping around the counter to close the distance between us, "if you just said it plainly. I hear you're good at that. Facts. Stating them." Something in his face eased, that careful, guarded thing he carried under all the polish loosening just slightly, the way it only ever did around me, in my shop, at the end of a long day, where nobody from Sinclair Ventures could see him be anything other than composed. "Caleb Whitman," he said, quiet and steady, "will you have dinner with me? Not a windowsill, not 11 minutes. An actual table, with actual conversation, where I get to look at you without pretending it's about the pastries. You could have just led with that. I'm an alpha CEO," he said, with real, wounded dignity. "We don't lead with vulnerability, it's in the bylaws." I laughed until my ribs hurt and told him yes, obviously yes, and spent the rest of that week catching myself smiling at nothing, at the proofing dough, at the oven timer, at a stray thought of his crooked half-smile, in a way that made Priya start an actual betting pool with the regulars about how long it would take before I finally kissed the sad rich man properly. A pool I later found out my own mother had, humiliatingly, indirectly contributed to through Ronnie. He took me to a tiny, unglamorous Italian place in the North End that didn't take reservations for anyone, which meant absolutely nothing to James Sinclair, who apparently owned the building. We shared one plate of cacio e pepe because he insisted, with total seriousness, that sharing food was an efficient use of table space, which I told him was the least romantic justification for feeding your date I had ever heard, right up until he reached across the table, wound pasta onto his fork, and held it up to my mouth instead of his own, watching me with an intensity that made the whole restaurant disappear. That, I said, once I'd swallowed throat tight, was significantly more romantic than the setup led me to expect. "I contain multitudes," he said, and reached for my hand across the table like it was the easiest, most natural thing in the world, like he'd been doing it for years instead of minutes. "Caleb, I need to tell you something, and I'd like you to let me get through the whole sentence before you make a joke, because I know you, and I know you deflect with humor when things get too honest too fast." I closed my mouth, mid-joke, and nodded. "I have spent 31 years being extremely good at things that don't require my heart," he said, low, steady, watching me like I was the only fixed point in a very large, very cold room. "Acquisitions, negotiations, knowing exactly what a building is worth before I walk in the door. I have never once, in my adult life, wanted something I couldn't calculate the value of in advance." His thumb moved slowly over my knuckles. "I don't know how to calculate this. I have absolutely no idea what you're worth to me, Caleb, because every time I try to put a number on it, the number just keeps going. It won't stop. It's the least efficient, least strategic thing I've ever felt, and I would like very much to keep feeling it if you'll let me." I didn't make a joke. I didn't have one in me. I just leaned across the small table, cupped his face in both hands, flour-scared, oven-burned hands that had never once touched anything worth as much as the man in front of me, and kissed him, slow and certain, in the middle of a restaurant that suddenly felt very warm. "For a man who says he doesn't do vulnerability," I murmured against his mouth, "you're remarkably good at it when it counts." "Don't tell my board," he said, and kissed me again before I could laugh, and I decided, somewhere between the second kiss and the waiter's extremely polite decision to check on a different table entirely, that I was going to enjoy this life a great deal more than the last one. Summer settled over Boston the way it always does, humid, loud, smelling like the harbor and somebody's badly timed fireworks. And James and I settled into something that felt, terrifyingly, like an actual relationship, complete with routines I would have mocked mercilessly in my first life for being domestic and sweet, and entirely too soft for a man who used to pride himself on needing nobody. He took me sailing once, on a boat that belonged, of course, to Sinclair Ventures, and spent the first 20 minutes giving me a thoroughly unnecessary safety briefing before admitting, sheepishly, that he'd never actually taken the boat out himself, and had, in fact, hired a captain who was currently steering while pretending not to listen to us. I laughed so hard I nearly went overboard, which he found significantly less funny than I did, and which resulted in him keeping one hand permanently hooked through my belt loop for the rest of the afternoon, a habit he never fully abandoned even months later, on dry land, for reasons neither of us examined too closely. I taught him to laminate dough on a lazy Sunday when the bakery was closed, and discovered that a man capable of closing 9-figure real estate deals without breaking a sweat was entirely undone by the concept of folding butter into flour in even thirds. He took it with the grim seriousness of a battlefield strategist, muttering about structural integrity and load-bearing gluten like he was reviewing a building permit, and produced, after 4 attempts, a croissant so lopsided it looked actively embarrassed of itself. "It's structurally sound," he informed me, holding up the misshapen thing like a trophy. "It looks like it's been through a divorce. It has character. It has problems, James." He ate the whole thing anyway, standing at my counter in an apron I'd forced him into. The first and only time I ever saw James Sinclair in an apron, a sight I photographed extensively and have used since as leverage on multiple occasions, and declared it, around a mouthful of his own lopsided pastry, the finest thing he'd ever made, which was true only in the sense that it was the only thing he'd ever made, a distinction he refused to acknowledge. That was the summer I stopped flinching when my phone buzzed with my parents' name on the screen. The summer Priya started referring to James, fondly and without permission, as the boyfriend, and the summer I realized, somewhere between sailing lessons and ruined croissants, that I had built, quietly, without meaning to, without asking anyone's permission, a life I actually wanted to keep. I would love to tell you the rest of this story was uncomplicated warmth and flour and stolen kisses over pastry cases, and mostly, gloriously, it was, but no proper story lets the villain-adjacent replacement son get away scot-free, and Nathaniel Cole, bless his symmetrical face, ended up providing his own comeuppance without any help from me at all, which honestly made it funnier. It turned out that being the golden heir apparent came with actual responsibilities, and Nathaniel, charming, well-mannered, excellent with a salad fork, had exactly 0 business instincts. 6 months after the adoption gala, he authorized the acquisition of a once-in-a-lifetime antique collection that turned out to be, upon appraisal by an auction house across town, mostly upmarket flea market inventory, dressed up with fake provenance papers by a con man who had, it should be said, taken Nathaniel to a very nice lunch first. My father lost $400,000, and more importantly to a man like Robert Whitman, his composure, in front of the entire Boston auction community, at an event where I heard secondhand from Ronnie, who relayed it with the barely contained glee of a woman watching a soap opera she'd waited years for. Nathaniel had insisted on presenting the deal personally, over my father's mild objections, to prove he could handle things on his own. "You should have seen your dad's face," Ronnie told me over the phone, practically wheezing. "He went so red I thought we were going to need the defibrillator from the Foundation gala kit, and Nathaniel just stood there going, I really thought the letters of provenance were authentic, like a golden retriever who ate the good couch cushion and is only now discovering consequences exist. I bit back a laugh, badly. "That's terrible. Poor guy. You're smiling. I can hear you smiling. I'm not smiling." "Caleb Robert Whitman, I invented your smile. I would recognize it over a phone line." I wasn't gloating exactly. Or, fine, I was gloating a little, but gently, the way you gloat when karma does your dirty work for you, and you didn't even have to lift a finger. Nathaniel wasn't cruel. He was just, it turned out, spectacularly unsuited to a job he'd been handed instead of earned, and the whole family was finding that out in real time, loudly, at parties, which was frankly the funniest possible way for it to happen. The final, glorious blow came at the Foundation's summer benefit, an event I did not attend, but heard about from at least 4 separate sources within 24 hours. Nathaniel, attempting to impress a room of donors with a toast about the Whitman legacy, got the name of the Foundation's largest historical grant recipient wrong, twice, in front of the actual grant recipient, who stood up mid-speech to correct him with visible, magnificent disdain. He called the Boston Maritime Archive the Boston Nautical Museum. Ronnie reported gleefully, and then when the guy corrected him, he called it the Naval Historical Society. 3 wrong names, in one toast. Your mother had to physically take the microphone from him. I laughed until I had to sit down on my own kitchen floor, flower handprints and all. And I want the record to reflect that Priya, present for this call on speaker, laughed even harder and had to be physically removed from the walk-in fridge where she had retreated to compose herself. That wasn't even the last of it. 2 weeks later, Nathaniel, apparently trying to recover some ground after the antique disaster, decided to personally handle a delicate estate sale for a prominent Beacon Hill family, only to accidentally authorize the sale of a client's actual, still-living cat along with a lot of Federal-era furniture, having mistaken it, in the confusion of an overpacked townhouse, for a very convincing taxidermied decoration. The cat, unharmed and reportedly furious, was recovered from the auction preview room by a horrified junior associate before any bidding occurred, but not before 3 separate society blogs got hold of the story, and Robert Whitman spent an entire week fielding calls that began with the words, "So I hear you tried to sell someone's cat." He's calling it the incident. Ronnie reported, wheezing so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Capital I, like it's a war. Your dad had to issue an actual statement, on letterhead. Was the cat okay? The cat is thriving. The cat has apparently been given a small silver dish out of guilt. Nathaniel is not thriving. Nathaniel has been banned from estate sales indefinitely, which he described to your mother as honestly a relief. By August, Robert Whitman had quietly, without any public announcement of failure, because appearances mattered more to my father than almost anything, including, apparently, the son he'd chosen, begun sitting in on every meeting Nathaniel took. By September, sitting in on had become taking over. By October, Nathaniel had been moved, gently but unmistakably, from heir to assistant to the heir, a title that fooled absolutely nobody, least of all the 400 people who'd applauded his adoption the year before. I found out about all of this the way I found out about everything now, from a safe, self-chosen distance, with a bakery full of regular customers and an alpha CEO who showed up every single morning for a croissant and 11 quiet minutes that had, somewhere along the line, become the best part of my day. Some mornings I still let myself sleep an extra 15 minutes before opening, purely out of a spite toward my own former work ethic. And James had learned to simply push the door open with his shoulder and start the espresso machine himself rather than wait, which I chose to interpret as devotion rather than impatience. I wasn't there to see any of it, and for the first time in either version of my life, that felt like winning. My father called in November. I almost didn't pick up. I was elbow-deep in laminated dough, and James was on his windowsill perch, watching me with the specific fond amusement he reserved for watching me work, which was frankly becoming a problem for my ability to concentrate on lamination, but something made me answer. "Caleb." My father's voice, over the phone, sounded older than I remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with pastry con men. "I'd like you to come to dinner. Just family." Just family, like I hadn't spent an entire year being quietly excised from that category by everyone in it but Ronnie. "I'm working," I said, which was true, and also the closest thing to a defense I could muster on short notice. "Caleb." A pause, and then, in a voice I had genuinely never heard my father use in either lifetime, small, almost embarrassed, "I made a mistake." James, across the bakery, had gone very still, watching my face with the particular attentiveness of a man ready to intervene the second I needed him to. I found oddly that just having him there, not saying anything, not doing anything, just present, solid, watching, made the whole conversation easier to have. "Which mistake, specifically?" I asked, and I meant it lightly, not cruelly, because half a year of building something entirely mine had done something no amount of childhood resentment ever managed. It had taken the sting out of the question. "You'll have to be more specific. There's a list. I keep it filed next to my recipe box." My father actually laughed, a short, surprised, humiliated sound. "Fair. All of it, I suppose. I thought I was choosing stability. Nathaniel needed a family, and I told myself I was doing a kind thing, and I let it become an excuse to stop looking at what I already had." A pause, thick with things my father had clearly never practiced saying out loud. "You built an entire business on your own, without a dollar of mine, in under a year. Nathaniel's had every advantage I could give him for 4 years, and he still doesn't know the difference between provenance and a con man's Christmas card. I've been an idiot, son. Say that again, I said, before I could stop myself. I want it on a mug. There was a pause, and then, to my genuine astonishment, my father laughed again, wetter this time. You'd sell them at the bakery, wouldn't you? Robert Whitman was wrong. A mug for every occasion. I'd sell out in a week. Son. He'd said it, in the middle of all that, plain and unadorned, without the qualifying weight it had always carried in either lifetime. My other son, my biological son, a small word that had always made it clear I was one of two, and not, in the end, the favorite of the two. Just son, like I'd earned my way back into the word by never once fighting for it. I'm not coming back to run the auction house, Dad, I said gently, because that felt like the important thing to clear up first. I have a bakery. I love my bakery. I also frankly love sleeping in until 7, which the auction house has never once permitted. I know. Another pause. I'm not calling to ask you back into the business. I'm calling to ask you back to dinner. Just dinner, whatever you want to bring. Your mother's been making your name in gold lettering out of gilt since June. She thinks I don't notice her practicing it on stationery. I laughed, actually laughed, surprised and a little wrecked by it, and across the counter James's whole posture eased, like he'd been holding some tension on my behalf that only released when I did. I'll think about it. I told my father, which was, for the first time, entirely true. Not a polite deflection, not a wound dressed up as diplomacy. Just an honest answer from a man who finally had the luxury of choosing. That's all I'm asking, he said, and then, after a beat in the careful, slightly formal voice he used whenever he was trying to say something he hadn't rehearsed properly, your mother mentioned you have a gentleman, Sinclair's boy. Is that serious? Extremely, I said, watching James pretend very hard not to be listening while doing exactly that, from 6 feet away, ears practically swiveling like a cartoon fox. He proposed marriage to a windowsill first, if that tells you anything. That tells me everything, my father said, dry in a way that startled a laugh out of me, because it was unmistakably a joke, an actual joke, from Robert Whitman, a man I did not think had ever made one on purpose in either of my lifetimes. Bring him to dinner too, then. God knows the man's already inserted himself into every deal I've tried to close this year. Might as well feed him. I didn't tell James about the call. I didn't have to. Priya, disloyal and delighted, told him everything the second I stepped into the back to check the oven, and by the time I came back out he was leaning on the counter with an expression of carefully banked fury that made him look absurdly even more handsome. He wants you back, James said. Not a question. Just for dinner. He's not offering me the company. He's offering me lasagna and my mother's guilt. And are you going? I considered him. This ridiculous, magnificent man who had, over the better part of a year, rearranged an entire morning routine around 11 minutes at my windowsill, who had once cornered my father at the Cabot Real Estate Summit and, according to 3 separate witnesses, coldly informed him that some men don't recognize what they have until someone else notices it for them. A sentence that had apparently rattled Robert Whitman enough that he brought it up on the phone without ever quite explaining where he'd heard it. You talked to my father, I said. Not a question either. James had the decency to look, briefly, like a man caught. I may have mentioned, at the Cabot Summit, that Whitman and Holt's competitors were beginning to notice their former heir apparent's public relations disasters, and that the actual heir was thriving spectacularly 2 blocks from Newbury Street, entirely without family assistance. A pause. It's not my fault your father is a man who only values what other people are visibly interested in. James. I stared at him. Did you go around Boston strategically complimenting me to my father's business rivals? I went around Boston stating facts, he said, with the particular dignity of a man who knew exactly how transparent he was being and had decided not to care. The facts happened to be flattering. That's not my doing, that's your croissants' doing. Sure, blame the croissants. They can't defend themselves, they're very buttery and extremely guilty. I laughed until I had to lean on the counter, and when I looked up he was watching me with an expression so open, so entirely without its usual careful diplomacy, that it stole the air out of my next laugh completely. Come to dinner, he said, quieter now, not because you owe them anything, because you get to decide what this looks like now. You didn't have that before. You didn't have that before. He didn't know, couldn't have known, exactly how true that was. How in another version of this story I'd spent years trying to earn back a seat that was never actually mine, and had died still trying. He just knew, somehow, the shape of what I needed to hear. "Come with me," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. James blinked. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions before breakfast, he looked genuinely, endearingly thrown. "To your family dinner. You already crashed my grand reopening and my father's business gossip circuit. Might as well make it official. Consider it a hostile takeover of my mother's dining table." The smile that broke across his face then was the realest one I'd ever seen on him. Not the rumor of a smile, not the diplomatic curve he wore for cameras, but something unguarded and a little stunned, like a man who'd been braced for a very different answer. "I'd be honored," he said, and reached across the counter to take my flour-dusted hand in both of his, warm and careful, like something he intended to keep. "Caleb, for what it's worth, I would have begged you to stay that first night on the terrace, if I'd thought for 1 second you wanted to hear it from me." "You're a CEO," I said, throat tight. "You don't beg." "For you," he said, simply, "I'd have made an exception." Dinner was, against every expectation I walked in with, almost normal. My mother cried within the first 4 minutes, over the appetizer, which felt about right for her. My father shook James's hand with the wary respect of a man who had recently been quietly outmaneuvered in front of his entire industry and had decided the smartest move was to be gracious about it. Nathaniel, to everyone's surprise, including his own, showed up halfway through the main course, apologized, plainly, without performance, and then spent the rest of dinner asking me increasingly desperate questions about whether the auction house had any openings in literally any department that did not involve making decisions, which made Ronnie laugh so hard she had to leave the table. "I think," Nathaniel said, staring miserably at his plate, "I think I might actually be quite good at cataloging, things that don't move, or talk back, or have opinions about provenance." "There's a whole archive department," I told him, and meant it kindly, because it turns out it's very hard to hold a grudge against a man whose greatest crime was being loved by people who should have loved someone else better all along. "You'd probably be happy there. Low stakes, excellent lighting. Nobody's ever lost $400,000 over a misfiled ledger." "I would like," Nathaniel said with real feeling, "to never present a business deal again as long as I live." "What about cats?" Ronnie said, deadly innocent, reaching for the bread basket. "Any strong feelings on cats specifically, or is it more of a general aversion to living things with opinions?" Nathaniel put his face directly into his napkin. My mother made a small, strangled noise into her wine glass. My father, to his enormous credit, did not so much as blink, which I have to assume took considerable practice over the preceding months. "The cat," Nathaniel said, muffled, from inside the napkin, "has an Instagram now. It has more followers than I do." "As it should," Ronnie said, entirely without mercy, and reached over to pat his shoulder with the exact false sympathy she'd once reserved for me at every family function where Nathaniel got the better seat. There was something almost generous about watching her redirect it, like the family finally had room for more than one person to be gently, lovingly mocked at the table, and it wasn't only ever going to be me. My father, at the head of the table, looked between the two of us. The son he'd chosen, visibly relieved to be handed a filing cabinet instead of a company, and the son he'd nearly lost, sitting there with an alpha CEO's hand resting quietly, possessively, on the back of his chair, and something in his face finally, genuinely settled. "I owe you an apology I don't think I can make properly at a dinner table," he said to me, low, just for me, while my mother and James debated, with surprising enthusiasm, the merits of a waterfront development James's company was pitching 2 blocks from the auction house. I spent 4 years telling myself I was building a bigger family. I never once asked if I was losing the one I already had. "You're not losing me," I said, and found, saying it, that I actually meant it, not out of obligation, not out of the old hunger to be chosen, but out of the specific hard-won security of a man who no longer needed his family's approval to know his own worth. "You just don't get to have all of me the way you used to. I've got a bakery now." And apparently, I glanced at James, who was gesturing with a dinner roll to make some architectural point, utterly unself-conscious in a way I'd genuinely never seen him be in public before. A very persistent alpha who crashed a family dinner to make sure I actually got dessert. "He's insufferable," my father said, with something that might, from Robert Whitman, have qualified as fondness. He cornered me at the Cabot Summit and quoted my own company's earnings report back at me to make a point about you. That sounds right. Did he also mention the croissants? At length. He does that. It's a whole bit. I've stopped trying to stop him. I like him, my father admitted, grudging and sincere in equal measure. God help me. Under the table, James's hand found mine, warm and sure, and I laced our fingers together without a single flicker of the old fear that had once made me shrink smaller at every family table I sat at, trying to take up less room, trying not to be the disappointing one. I wasn't disappointing anyone anymore. I'd stopped needing to be anything other than exactly what I was, including, apparently, a man who would rather nap through an extra 15 minutes of morning than open his own shop on time, which my mother found scandalous, and James found, inexplicably, one of my more endearing qualities. James proposed 4 months later, on a Tuesday, which he later insisted was strategic, because Tuesdays were the bakery's slowest day and therefore statistically the lowest risk day for you to say no while holding a hot tray. That's the least romantic reasoning I've ever heard, I told him, when he confessed this month into our engagement. I run a hospitality empire on risk mitigation, Caleb. Love doesn't get an exception. Love apparently gets a spreadsheet. I made you a very good spreadsheet, he said, with total sincerity, and I loved him so much in that moment I nearly dropped the ring box back into his hands out of sheer helpless affection. Here's how it actually happened. I was pulling a tray of morning buns out of the oven, hair a disaster, apron dusted white, absolutely not dressed for a life-altering moment, when James walked in, 11 minutes early, which should have tipped me off, and instead of taking his usual windowsill perch, got down on one knee in the middle of my very small, very flour-covered bakery, in front of Priya, 4 regulars, and one extremely startled UPS driver who would later tell anyone who'd listen that Newbury Street delivery routes were, in his professional opinion, chronically underrated for drama. Caleb Whitman, he said, and his voice, usually so composed, cracked slightly on my name. I have sat on that windowsill nearly every morning for the better part of a year because some part of me knew, long before the rest of me caught up, that I did not want a single day to start without seeing you first. I once told you I'd hold you to your promise about the best croissant in Boston. I'd like to hold you to a few other promises now, if you'll let me. James, I have a tray of morning buns, I said, laughing and crying in roughly equal measure, still holding the hot tray with both oven mitts, because apparently my brain had decided the pastry outranked the proposal in my priority queue. Put down the buns, Caleb. They'll burn. I own a hospitality empire. I will personally pay for new buns. I set down the tray. Priya, behind the counter, was already filming, sobbing audibly, which she would later deny with a completely straight face, while the video played, undeniably, in the background. Yes, I said, before he'd even fully finished the question, because some things you don't need 11 minutes to decide. Yes, obviously, yes. He kissed me right there in the middle of my flour-dusted, croissant-scented, slightly ruined little kingdom, in front of God and Priya and one bewildered UPS driver holding a package neither of us would remember to sign for, and it tasted like butter and sugar and every single morning I'd get to wake up to for the rest of both my lives. We got married in June, on the roof of one of James's smaller, less ostentatious hotels overlooking the harbor, with my father giving a toast that only mentioned the word acquisition once, which my mother and I both agreed to count as growth. Nathaniel, thriving in the archive department, gave me a set of hand-restored antique pastry tools as a wedding gift, and cried harder than anyone except my mother, who cried through the entire ceremony in a way that finally, mercifully, felt like the good kind of tears. 6 months into marriage, I can report the following facts, gathered through extensive, ongoing field research. 1. James Sinclair, a man who once negotiated a hostile takeover in under 4 hours without raising his voice, is entirely incapable of assembling flat-pack furniture, a fact I discovered on our second week in the new apartment, watching a 6'2" alpha CEO sit on the floor surrounded by unlabeled Allen wrenches, glaring at a bookshelf like it had personally wronged Sinclair Ventures. I don't understand, he said, with the wounded dignity of a man used to winning. I have an MBA. The bookshelf doesn't care about your MBA, James. The bookshelf, he informed me, with total seriousness, is being unreasonable. I ended up building it myself in 20 minutes flat, mostly out of impatience, while he supervised from the couch, offering strategic input that consisted entirely of, "Have you considered a different approach?" Until I threatened him with the Allen wrench, and he, laughing, surrendered completely and made us both tea instead, which I let him do, because delegating the tea-making felt like a fair and reasonable use of my remaining energy for the day. 2. He still comes to the bakery. Every morning, without fail, even now that our apartment is a 20-minute drive from Beacon Rolls, even on days when he has back-to-back board meetings starting at 7. He still sits on what Priya insists on calling the CEO's perch, now permanently marked with a small brass plaque she had made without telling either of us, reading, "Resard for the Alpher, begged." James pretends to be scandalized by it every time, and has, notably, never once asked her to take it down. 3. My father calls every Sunday now, mostly to complain fondly about Nathaniel's ongoing crusade to alphabetize the entire archive by a system nobody else understands, and to ask, every single week, in the exact same careful tone, whether I'm happy. I tell him yes, every single week, and mean it more each time. He has also, twice, asked whether the bakery might consider a second location, closer to the house, which I have twice declined, on the grounds that I already work quite hard enough, thank you. 4. And this one I only tell you because James would deny it under oath if you asked him directly. The man who once described love as something that doesn't get an exception from risk mitigation still keeps, in his top desk drawer at Sinclair Ventures, the original receipt from Beacon Roll's grand reopening, the very first ticket from the very first croissant he ever bought me, folded soft at the edges from being carried and refolded more times than either of us will ever admit to. I found it by accident, looking for a stapler, 3 months into our marriage, and did not say anything. I just kissed him, that evening, a little longer than usual, and let him wonder, laughing against my mouth, what exactly he'd done to deserve it. He asked, twice, with genuine confusion, in the exact tone of a man reviewing a contract for a clause he couldn't quite locate, and I told him, both times, that some things a person is allowed to keep to himself, which only made him more suspicious and considerably more attentive for the following week, an outcome I regretted exactly 0%. Nothing in particular, I told him, just felt like it. He didn't believe me. He never does when I say things like that. Some quiet, careful part of him still braced, even now, for the day someone decides he's not worth keeping. 5. James has, against every prediction I would have made about a man who once described love as a spreadsheet, become quietly, thoroughly domestic in ways his own board would never believe if I showed them the security footage. He has learned, with the grim determination he usually reserves for hostile mergers, exactly how I like my coffee. Too strong, too much cinnamon, a fact he discovered by trial and 4 ruined mugs and refused to give up on until he'd cracked the formula like it was a term sheet. He leaves sticky notes on the bathroom mirror before early meetings, short and businesslike in tone, and absolutely not businesslike in content. Board call at 7. Missed you already at 6:58. J. That I have, embarrassingly, kept every single one of, tucked into an old recipe tin on top of the fridge, which he does not know about, and which I intend to keep exactly that way. 6. My mother has fully recovered from her guilt spiral, and has instead redirected all of it into aggressively, joyfully planning our future in ways neither of us asked for. She has already picked out, unprompted, a lovely little brownstone 2 streets from the bakery for whenever you two decide you'd like more space, a sentence she delivers roughly once a month with the transparent hopefulness of a woman who spent 4 years choosing the wrong son and is now determined to make up for it by being unbearably, wonderfully present in the life of the right one. I let her plan. It makes her happy, and honestly, the brownstone has a beautiful kitchen, and I have never once pretended to be above being bribed with good countertops. 7. Nathaniel comes by the bakery now, most Thursdays, on his lunch break from the archive department, and orders the same thing every time, a plain croissant, black coffee, and invariably an update on the cat, who he has apparently continued to visit at its owner's insistence, on the grounds that he owes it an apology tour. He has gotten better company, honestly, now that nobody is asking him to run a company. He asked me once, quietly, over an otherwise unremarkable Thursday croissant, whether I'd ever really resented him, and I told him the truth. Not really. Not for long. Not once I stopped needing my parents' approval to know what I was worth. He seemed to need to hear that more than I expected, and I've decided that's fine. Everybody deserves at least one honest answer at the family table, even the son who wasn't supposed to need it. 8. And last. Some mornings, still, I catch myself waiting for the other shoe to drop. Old instinct, old scar tissue, the leftover reflex of a man who spent an entire first lifetime learning that being loved was conditional on being chosen over someone else. And then James walks in, 11 minutes early as always, settles onto his ridiculous brass-plate windowsill with his ridiculous good posture, and looks at me across the counter like I am, simply obviously, the best thing that has ever happened to Beacon Rolls. And the old instinct just quietly, gently lets go. Sometimes, late at night, when James is asleep with one arm thrown possessively over my side of the bed like he's worried I'll be repossessed by some higher authority, I think about the other version of this. The man in the tuxedo standing at the edge of a stage, smiling until his face ached, waiting for a family that had already made its choice. It doesn't hurt anymore, remembering him. Mostly I just feel a kind of distant, protective fondness for the guy, the way you'd feel about a younger cousin who hadn't figured things out yet. He didn't know he was allowed to stop performing. He didn't know that walking away from a chair nobody saved for him wasn't a loss at all. It was just the first available seat at a table that actually wanted him there. Nobody chose me over someone else this time. Nobody had to. James Sinclair just showed up morning after morning, 11 minutes at a time, until showing up became the whole entire point. Some people get reborn chasing revenge. I got reborn, apparently, chasing butter, spite, a decent amount of well-earned laziness, and a very stubborn alpha who refused to let me leave a coat check hallway without knowing exactly where I was headed. I'd call that a pretty good trade. If you enjoyed Caleb and James's very extra, very buttery second chance at love, follow the channel. More reborn rom-coms, growly alphas, and soft omegas with better comebacks than sense are on the way. See you at the next windowsill.